Before we get started, there's two things I'd like to mention. First is that all the slides, speakers notes, and the demos are available for download, and I'll be providing a link at the end of the talk. I tend to be one of those folks who can't keep up with the speaker and take notes at the same time. So for those folks in the same situation, there's no need to take notes. Everything I'm covering is going to be available for download. So let's start by getting on the same page. What is MDM? Well, in the context of Apple devices, mobile device management, or MDM, is a delivery mechanism for distributing data and settings to Apple devices. And this includes Macs, iPhones, iPads, and Apple TVs. Not yet the Apple Watch, but one of these days, it's coming. So more specifically, MDM is an API for sending device management commands. Now, not all these commands are backwards compatible, so MDM commands for a specific OS version and later won't work on earlier OS versions. When did MDM enter the picture? Well, Apple first rolled it out starting with iOS 4, and it came to the Mac platform starting with macOS 10.10.7 Lion. tvOS is an outgrowth of iOS 9, so the ability to use MDM has really been there on tvOS from the very start. Now you can use MDM to push email, security settings, applications, app settings, certificates, and even media content to Apple devices. And MDM also allows you to apply certain management workflows and settings that are impossible using other means. And we'll be discussing the ones listed on the screen later in the talk. Now there's two major components to MDM. There's Apple's push notification service, and then there's the MDM server used to manage those devices. So let's take a look at APNS first. So when you take your new Apple device out of its box and you power it on for the first time, it doesn't yet know how to connect to APNS. Now, this is because it may have been sitting in its box for a while, and Apple wants to make sure that it's getting the latest information. What the Apple device does know is the address of the initialization server that it's supposed to talk to, and that it's supposed to download what's called a bag file. Now, the bag file is a plist which contains the necessary data for the Apple device to start talking to APNS. So now that the Apple device knows how and where to start talking to APNS, it'll open up a connection and it'll say hello. APNS says hello back and it'll provide a certificate. The device checks the certificate, verifies that it's valid, and that tells the device that APNS can be trusted to communicate with. Now the device has an Apple issued device certificate, so once the device is verified that the certificate provided by APNS is valid, it'll send that device certificate up to APNS. APNS on its end will check the certificate it's been sent by the device and verify that it's valid, and that'll tell APNS that the device can be trusted to communicate with. Now, once both sides know that the opposite end can be trusted to communicate with, they'll exchange cryptographic ciphers and they'll start a secure conversation. Now, APNS will be used by Apple devices regardless of whether or not they're enrolled in a mobile device management service or not. For the various apps on your Apple device that use push notifications, APNS is going to be how those notifications get sent to your device. Now, APNS also requires having certain ports opened outbound, and details on that are available via the link on the screen. And this is probably going to be the part of the KBase article where your InfoSec and firewall folks may start shaking their heads and saying things like no, no, and can't do it. Now, for those folks having that argument with their security or network folks, here are some important facts to know. So once that argument is over and they've agreed to open up the needed ports, you may find that they didn't actually open up all the necessary ports. Now, to help check this, Toucan software makes a great diagnostics tool. And if everything has been set up correctly, you should get results like this. But if not, there is a log available so you can go and check what went wrong. So for more information about APNS and how it works, I really encourage you to check out Brad Chapman's talk on the subject. It was given at Jamf Nation User Conference in 2017, and it's available via the link on the screen. Now, let's turn our attention to the other half of mobile device management, which is the MDM server. So, what's an MDM server? Well, when you get down to it, it's an HTTP server which responds to communication with either a plist containing a command or HTTP 200, which is the OK response. Now, most traffic between a device and the MDM server it's enrolled with are going to be plist being sent back and forth. Now, depending on the contents of the plist, some of what's being passed will be digitally signed or encrypted. For an example, this is what a request from the MDM server for a device inventory may look like. And this is what a command from the MDM server to install a certain management profile may look like. And an MDM server also needs certificates. There are two types of certificates specifically used by MDM servers. The first is the APNS vendor certificate, and the other one is the APNS push certificate. So let's first look at the APNS vendor certificate. This is a special certificate which is used to generate the signing request for an APNS push certificate prior to uploading that request to Apple for an APNS certificate. Now, for folks familiar with Jamf Pro, you may have seen this as part of setting up or renewing your APNS push certificate. As part of the APNS setup or renewal, you can select the option of downloading a signed CSR from Jamf Nation. And the next thing is that you're asked to provide your Jamf Nation credentials. Once those credentials are provided, a signed certificate request for APNS is then downloaded to your Mac. So what's happening in the background is that your Jamf Pro server is communicating with a backend system with access to the APNS vendor certificate to generate that certificate request for your Jamf Pro server. And what is generated is an encrypted plist, ready for uploading to Apple's push certificates portal. So that brings us to the APNS push certificate. So this is a special certificate used by MDM servers to communicate with APNS. Now, if you've ever set up or renewed an APNS push certificate, you've used the site referenced on the screen. It's where you take the certificate request generated by your MDM and you use it to get a push notification certificate. Now, your ability to generate a push notification certificate is tied to an Apple ID, which you use to log into the portal site. And when it comes to the Apple ID used for your APNS certificates, I have some short do's and don'ts to keep in mind. Where possible, you should try to have one Apple ID per APNS certificate and make sure that you have them documented. You should also make sure that you're not using a personal Apple ID or one tied to your work email address. If you can, have a dedicated email mailbox set up just for the Apple IDs involved. Also, really important, do not lose the password for the Apple ID in question. Now, to show what can happen if you don't follow those rules, here's what the portal looks like when I log in with my personal Apple ID. I've got two active APNS certificates, and now I have to figure out which specific APNS certificate goes with my MDM server. Now, this is important for reasons I'll discuss in a bit. So I think I've got the right one figured out, so let's upload that CSR. Great. I've got a new APNS push certificate. Let's download it and then get it over to my MDM server. Wow, this looks bad. What happened? Well, Apple's push notification service is a chain of trust with multiple security factors built into that chain. The first part is a certificate that I received from the push certificate portal. When inspected, the certificate looks like this. The second part is what's known as the topic, which is a specific UUID identifier associated with your MDM server. The certificate generated by the push notification portal will include the topic in both the common name and the user ID fields of that certificate. And this information is also visible if you click the info button next to the relevant certificate on the portal page. And the topic is also embedded in the MDM profile that your MDM server issues to your Apple device, with the topic field listing the user ID field of the APNS push certificate. So to circle back to my earlier problem with the push notification certificate, I'd accidentally created a new push certificate for my MDM instead of renewing my existing one. Because the topic is a UUID, it's going to be unique per MDM push notification certificate, and it can only be included in push notification certificates if that certificate is being renewed. Oops. Well, fortunately, my MDM had warned me before I actually uploaded the new certificate with a different topic. If I'd gone ahead and uploaded it, I would have broken the middle of my trusted chain of certificates. All devices enrolled with my MDM would have instantly lost the ability to communicate with the server because APNS would no longer be able to point them to the correct MDM server. So once I went back, created a new CSR, and made sure to renew the correct APNS certificate this time, everything was fine. So with that knowledge, let's take a look at how the MDM server talks to APNS. Like an Apple device, it opens a connection and it says hello. APNS will say hello back and respond with a certificate. The MDM server checks the certificate and verifies that it's valid, telling the server that APNS can be trusted to communicate with. This is just like with the device. The MDM server now sends the APNS push certificate it was issued by the Apple push certificate portal. APNS will check the push notification certificate it's been sent and verifies that it's valid, telling the APNS that the MDM can be trusted to communicate with. Now, once both sides know that the opposite end can be trusted, they exchange cryptographic ciphers and they start their secure conversation. However, the push certificate and the topic are not the end of this chain of certificates. The last link for devices is what's known as the device token. This token is generated by APNS and it's unique to the device. Now, these tokens are the same kind of tokens that APNS assigns to applications which use push notifications. And in this case, the application in question is your MDM server. But how does the device get the token from APNS and know to forward it to the MDM server? Well, this happens as part of MDM enrollment. The device connects to your MDM server and sends in an enrollment request. As part of the enrollment process, the MDM configuration profile is downloaded to the device. The device is now managed by the MDM server and it's able to communicate securely. Now that the MDM profile is in place on the device will register itself with APNS using the topic. APNS will then generate a token based on the combination of the device ID and the MDM topic. And once APNS has generated that token, it's sent down to the device. And once the token is sent to the device by APNS, the device then forwards it to the MDM server. Once the MDM server has it, the token is associated with the MDM's record for that device. Now, this device token may change occasionally. When it changes is detected, the device will automatically check in with the MDM server and report the new token. So along with the token generated by APNS, the device itself also generates a unique string known as push magic. So this is sent to the MDM server and associated with the MDM's record for that device. This push magic value is a UUID that ensures that the MDM server is talking to the right device when it sends commands. So now everything involved has the right cryptographic trust relationships in place to communicate securely with each other. So let's use that to send commands to our managed devices. Now, first step is the MDM server creating a notification payload using the token and the push magic of the device it wants to send something to. Next, APNS forwards the notification to the device. The device verifies that the topic, token, and push magic match, then it'll accept the notification. The device sends feedback via APNS that it has successfully received and decoded the notification. And in response to the notification, the device checks in with the MDM and gets whatever command or configuration settings that the MDM has for it. So one thing that's important to understand is that no management data ever goes over APNS. APNS is only ever used as a trigger mechanism to make the device ask its MDM for commands to run. So this genericness is what allows APNS to be used by everybody who needs to send push notification. Because APNS is only ever telling the device to check in with whatever originally generated that notification. And APNS is also pretty secure because of its verification scheme. By the time an APNS notification reaches its target device, it relies on the push notification certificate being valid, the topic being valid, the token being valid, and the push magic string being valid. If any of these are not valid, the notification is automatically discarded by the system. So now we know how MDM works, but why do we need it? Well, instead of imaging, Apple is now encouraging folks to use the device enrollment program, which I think has now been retitled the automatic enrollment program, as part of their deployment strategy. And what does DEP require? Well, it requires an MDM server. Using DEP, Macs can be automatically enrolled with an MDM server as part of their initial setup. And the MDM server can then run whatever deployment process is desired by a company, school, or institution. So let's take a look at how this works for my own shop. So in my case, I'm working for SAP, and it's telling me that SAP can automatically configure my computer. So I just need to put in my SAP username and password, hit connect. It'll enroll in our MDM server, and it'll set up my account using the information that I provided. It'll also skip certain panes in the setup assistant process if I told it to do so. And then it goes ahead and sets up my Mac for first use. Another Apple program which leverages MDM is the Volume Purchase Program for distributing software from the App Store. VPP's latest way of assigning App Store licenses to devices relies on an MDM server to both manage the device and also assign the license. Assigning licenses directly to devices means avoiding the need to have an Apple ID involved in the license assignment. Instead, the MDM server can assign a license to the computer record it has, and the app can install silently on the Mac in question. And bring up the tail of MDM's capabilities is one that MDM has had since its introduction, which is the ability to lock or wipe devices. So these are likely MDM's least thought of functions, at least until a VIP leaves their Mac or iOS device in the back of a taxi somewhere. However, they can be a lifesaver in such situations as they allow a device to be either remotely locked or completely wiped to prevent access to the data stored on it. So let's take a look at how this works for locking up a Mac in this case. So you're asked to set a passcode, and you have the option of setting a lock message. So in this case, I'm setting it for a very secure passcode, as you can see, and I'm setting a message that computer's been locked. Please call this number. And now let's go ahead and lock the computer. Yes, I'm sure. So let's see what it looks like on the Mac's end when this happens. First thing that happens is that the Mac automatically reboots. At that point, it goes to a special EFI screen where it tells me computer's been locked. Please call this number and enter your system lock code to unlock this Mac. And what happens when I go ahead and enter that lock code? Well, the Mac reboots again. And at this point, I'm at my login screen, ready to log in again. So what if I'm wiping the computer? Well, in this case, again, I'm putting in a special passcode, but I'm not getting the option to set a message. Now, this is going to maybe vary across MDM solutions, but at least for Jamf Pro, when you're wiping it, you don't get the option to set that message, only when you're logging it. All right, let's see what it looks like on the Mac's end when this happens. The Mac reboots. And again, we're looking at that screen. But in this case, no message, and all we're being told is enter that lock code. So what happens when we put in that lock code? Well, we go ahead and reboot, but in the background, everything's been wiped. So when your Mac tries to reboot, it's going to fail because there's no OS on the machine. All right. So we've been discussing MDM, and we mentioned profiles, but we haven't really gone into detail about what they are. So let's again start by getting on the same page. What are profiles? In the context of Apple devices, profiles are files written in XML that provide information or management, and they can be used on Macs, iPhones, iPads, or Apple TVs. What can you do with them? Well, you can use them to deploy settings for the OS, app settings, certificates, and even some media content. How do they work? Well, here's a profile which is used for setting the desktop wallpaper on a Mac. In this case, the profile is setting the desktop background to use library, desktop pictures, acme.png. And when installed, the Mac will pick up the management settings in the profile, and it'll set the desktop wallpaper to the specified image. So when did profiles enter the picture? Well, along with MDM, Apple first rolled them out starting with iOS 4, and they came to the Mac platform starting with Lion. tvOS is, again, an outgrowth of iOS 9, so the ability to use profiles along with MDM has been on tvOS since the beginning. Now, for mobile devices, profiles are it for management. You don't have alternate means of managing these Apple devices. If there isn't a profile which does what you need to do, well, your main recourse is asking Apple for one. On Macs, though, it's a different story. When Apple brought MDM management to macOS 10 Lion, Apple wasn't starting from scratch for management like they had for iOS. Instead, Apple was building on an older management system known as Managed Clients. It was usually abbreviated as MCX, which stood for Managed Clients for macOS 10. And you can see this legacy to this day in many profiles. So in this case, I built a profile to manage a particular setting for a software application called EndNote. What's the payload for that profile? Well, it's an MCX setting, which the profile management system recognizes and can work with. So MCX had a variety of enforcement options, including the option to set a setting one time and thereafter the user had control over it. However, with Apple's introduction of MDM management for macOS 10, the default management option became to always manage that setting. Now, while it is still possible to manually build a profile that only applies a setting once, the general expectation is that management with a profile locks out user control over a setting. So if we look again at that EndNote profile, we can see that the always management option appearing as the forced setting in that payload. Now, if we wanted to change that to only apply once and then have it be a user controllable setting, we would change that key to once. And another legacy of MCX, which passed on to profiles on macOS, is that MCX did not provide total management of macOS 10. And that same holds true for profiles on macOS. And we'll be discussing this more later in the talk. So there's two different ways that a profile can provide management. There's management at the device level, and there's management at the user level. Device level management can get a little fuzzy because it applies to both global computer management settings and also user level settings for local users. User level is less fuzzy because it applies to user level management exclusively. However, it doesn't apply to all local user accounts. Instead, it applies to network user accounts and the specific local user account used to enroll a Mac into a mobile device management server. So that one local user account is often referred to as being MDM enabled. So a good example for something you would want to manage at the device level is a certificate that you want to deploy as a trusted root. Now, this could be a certificate used only internally at your company, so it's not part of the collection of trusted roots that Apple includes with the OS. In this case, it's the trusted root used by the company Wi-Fi. And once the profile is deployed, you would check keychain access for the system keychain, and you should see that certificate installed as a root certificate and automatically trusted for all users. When you remove the profile and recheck keychain access, the certificate should also be removed. Taking a look at user level management, a good example here is managing screensaver settings. Some screensaver settings can only be managed at the user level, like how long a computer needs to be idle before the screensaver comes on and what screensaver to use. So you need a user level profile here. Once a profile is deployed, check your screensaver settings. The start after time should be grayed out and set to what's in the profile. Meanwhile, you can click on other screensavers in the list, but the Mac will only use the one you specified in the profile. When you remove the profile and recheck the screensaver settings, the start after time should be active again, and you can select other screensavers. So how can you tell the difference between the two kinds of profiles? Well, they'll show up in the profiles preference pane in the right section for their type. When you have both types installed, the user level profiles will be grouped in the user profile section, while the device level profiles will be under the device profile section. And this separation also shows up when you're asking for profile information from the command line. When you run the profiles list command without root privileges, you see which profiles are installed for your user account. When you run the same command with root privileges, information about the device level profiles is displayed. And I'll be discussing the profiles command in more depth later. So now that we've talked about the different ways they can apply, let's take a look at how profiles are constructed from top to bottom. So there are a number of payloads which can be used at the top level of a profile. And here's the list of required payloads. So let's take a look at them in the context of an actual profile. First up in payload content, which defines the array of payload dictionaries. The array of payload dictionaries is what the profile is delivering to the Apple device. Now these could be management settings, certificates, or any other supported payload. Next up is payload identifier. Now this is the reverse DNS style identifier that identifies the profile. And that could be com.example.myprofile. This string is used to determine whether a new profile should replace an existing one or should be added. Payload type defines the type of payload. And at the top level of the profile, the only supported value is configuration. And payload UUID defines the globally unique identifier for the profile. The actual content is unimportant as long as that identifier itself is unique. Now on macOS, you can use the UUID gen command to generate reasonable UUIDs when building a profile. Payload version defines the version number of the profile format. And this number represents the version of the configuration profile as a whole, not the individual profile payloads within it. And at the top level of the profile, the only supported value is 1. Going along with the required top level payloads are a number of optional ones. Now, some of these are in common use while others aren't. So let's take a look at some that are commonly used enough that they may as well be required. Good examples are the payload display name, payload organization, and payload description payloads. Just about every well-written profile will have these. And the reason why is that they're the displayed parts of the profile that humans can read to understand what the profile does. One that is not in common use these days is encrypted payload content. This allows the use of encryption to protect the contents of profiles from unauthorized access. So one reason that they're uncommon is that the encrypted profile can only be decrypted using a private key previously installed on the device, which is receiving the encrypted profile. That includes your MDM server if you're planning to distribute encrypted profiles using an MDM. If your MDM doesn't have that private key installed in its certificate store, the profile won't successfully upload to the MDM because it can't be read by the MDM. Consequently, the most common way to install an encrypted profile is via an installer package or by hand. So in both cases, the profile isn't read until the actual time of installation, so that allows time to get the private key in place beforehand. Now, assuming that all else is fine and you want to create and use an encrypted profile, how does this work? Well, first you need to have a profile that you want to encrypt and a certificate's private key to encrypt with. So here's our profile. Why do we want to encrypt this? Well, our Wi-Fi password is sitting there in clear text for anyone who can read the contents of this profile. So how do we encrypt it? Well, first thing, we install our private key to encrypt with. And in this case, I'm going to use the private key associated with wifi.company.com. And once you have the private key available, you can then use user libexec MDM client to encrypt the profile. Now, this is not a well-documented function of the MDM client binary, so here's where I found it. Fellow MacAdmin in Australia who uses this name Mosen has done a terrific job of documenting both profile payloads and MDM commands, and he's included that on his site. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to go ahead and open up my unencrypted profile. And there is our password in the clear. Don't want that, so we're going to go ahead and encrypt this profile. So first things first, let's go ahead and get our private key in place. I'm going to do that by installing that wifi.company.com root CA. That's going to put in place my private key. Go into keychain access. There it is. All right, and it's trusted for everyone. Now let's go ahead and run user libexec MDM client. I'm going to tell it that I want to encrypt using wifi.company.com to reference it in the system keychain. I'm going to tell it the path to the profile that I want to encrypt. All right, so I went ahead, encrypted it, and here I've got a new profile sitting on my desktop. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. And now where previously I had an unencrypted block of text where you could get the password out, now I have an encrypted payload, content payload, and you can't read anything out of that. That's encrypted. So another uncommon one is consent text. This allows you to request that the profile installer agree to something before the profile is installed. So in this case, I'm putting the message in, by installing this profile, you agree to enable private system logging. Let's take a look at how this looks. Open it up in BBEdit. And there's our consent text. All right. Now let's go ahead and install it. Okay, continue, install. Am I sure? This is where that consent text is coming in. I put in my password, and now it's installed. And it's also possible to set a profile to be removed automatically after a specified amount of time using the RemovalDate and DurationUntilRemoval payloads. So for RemovalDate, you specify a date and time that the profile should remove itself. So in this case, the profile is set to be removed on April 21st at noon, US Eastern Time. For DurationUntilRemoval, you specify a number of seconds until the profile should remove itself. So in this case, the profile is set to remove itself after a week. Now it is possible to have both RemovalDate and DurationUntilRemoval in the same profile. And in that case, whichever one of those is earliest, that's when the profile will be removed. Now, there are still more optional payloads, but I'm going to leave those as additional research for those who are interested. Now, let's talk about making profiles. So handcrafting profiles can be a tedious task. So fortunately, there's a number of tools available to help with this. The three I've used most are MCX2Profile, Profile Creator, and iMazing's Profile Editor. So let's take a look at creating the same profile with all three tools, with disabling airdrop as our example. First, let's use MCX2Profile. This is an open source command line tool written by a MacAdmin named Tim Sutton. MCX2Profile is a conversion tool where it converts existing MCX management settings or plists to a profile. So we need to give it a plist to work with. In this case, we're going to use the defaults tool to create a plist with the settings to disable airdrop. So first things first, let's go ahead and run defaults write. I'm going to specify that I'm going to be writing to a file on the desktop. It's going to be ComApple network browser .plist. I'm going to tell it that I want to put in the disable airdrop command. And it's a Boolean value, so I'm going to put in bool yes, which is going to be true. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. And there we go. It's the only setting in that file, which is just what I want. And next, let's go ahead and run MCX2Profile. So I'm going to say invoke MCX2Profile. I'm going to say that my plist is the ComApple network browser plist that's sitting on my desktop. I'm going to put in my identifier as com.company disable airdrop. And say that I want to put that out on the desktop as disable airdrop.mobile config. All right. And then it goes ahead and appears out on the desktop. Let's go ahead and take a look at this profile now. And there we go. It sets up an entire profile for me with a custom payload description and custom identifier and display name. So here's how this profile looks when it's installed. Next, let's take a look at Profile Creator. Like MCX2Profile, this is an open source tool written by a MacAdmin, Eric Berglund. However, it uses a GUI interface instead of being a command line tool. So for Profile Creator, let's go ahead and start a new profile. There's a number of options available. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the airdrop one. I'm going to add that and then check off disable airdrop. And then in the general section, I'm going to put in the information that I want. So I'm going to call the name of it, the display name is going to be disable airdrop. Going to put in a short description of what this profile does. Disables airdrop on this Mac. Organization is company name. And here's where I set it to be a device level profile by calling it a system. All right, then I go ahead and save it. Now let's go ahead and export it. All right, let's go ahead and save this out into the desktop. And go ahead and take a look at this profile in BBEdit. It's not using the same MCX structure that MCX profile did. Instead, it's using more, the later generation of payloads. But again, it's going to disable airdrop. That's what it does. And here's how this profile looks when it's installed. Like I said, it looks a little different because it's not doing a conversion from a plist. Instead, here it's using natively available profile payloads. And Profile Creator will also give you the options of setting some default settings for all profiles, including your organization name and your profile identifier. Last but not least, let's look at iMazing's profile editor. Now, this is a commercial app from iMazing that was inspired by Profile Creator, and it was made available for free. So let's go ahead and launch that. And just need to find where airdrop is. So let's go ahead and search for it. All right, I found it. We're going to say we want to add that configuration payload and that we want to disable airdrop. All right. And here it's automatically populated that general pane for us to do. So first thing, let's put in that display name, which is going to be disable airdrop. I'm going to choose to keep the identifier that profile editor gave it. I'm going to call the organization company name and just put in that payload description. Disables airdrop on this Mac. And for the scope, I'm going to set it for system, which will make it a device level profile. All right. Let's go ahead and save this. Save it to my desktop. And if we go ahead and take a look. Again, this is using something very much like how Profile Creator was doing it. Instead of doing a conversion from MCX, it's just using the native available profile payloads. And here's how this profile looks when it's installed. Like the profile built with Profile Creator, like I said, is using the natively available profile payloads instead of converting them from a plist or from MCX. Profile Editor also gives you the options of setting some default settings for all profiles, including your organization name and your profile identifier. So now that we've looked at all three, which would I recommend for folks to use? If you're just getting started with Profile Creator, Profile Editor is what I would go with. Has an interface that helps you in a number of ways, and its search function is going to help you find payloads easily. If you're more advanced, take a look at Profile Creator. But of the three, MCX and Profile is going to offer the most flexibility because it allows you to create profiles from payloads that may not be available in either Profile Creator or Profile Editor. So now that you have your profile, how do you install them? Well, there's three ways. You're going to either install them by double clicking them. You can use the Profiles command line tool, or you can use an MDM server. So manual installation may be the simplest, but it's the hardest to manage for more than a handful of Macs. So in this case, you would double click on the profile and system preferences will ask you to confirm that you want to install it. Very straightforward. Manual removal is similar. You open the Profiles pane in System Preferences and you click the Removal button, which looks like a minus button. You'll be asked to authenticate as an admin user, and then the profile is removed. Now for command line installation, there's a couple of options available. One is to use the Profiles command line tool, and the other one is to copy the Profiles mobile config file into private var db configuration profiles setup. So to install using the Profiles tool, you would use the Profiles tool's install verb with the path flag, where the path is the directory path to the Profiles mobile config file. So let's take a look at how this works. There's no Profiles installed right now. So let's go ahead and run sudo profiles install. We're going to specify our path as being desktop stable airdrop.mobile config. We're going to put in our password. Now, if we go and take a look in system preferences, now we've got profiles there with our profile installed. To remove a profile using the Profiles tool, you would use the Profile tool's remove verb with the identifier flag, where the identifier is the payload identifier associated with the profile. So to find the installed Profiles identifiers, you can run the Profiles tool with the list verb. So let's take a look at how to do that. So first thing is let's run sudo profiles list. Put in our password for sudo. And it's going to give us that profile identifier, which in this case is computer name followed by a UUID. All right, and next we'll run sudo profiles remove and put in identifier. And then put in our identifier. Now if we go ahead and run sudo profiles list, there's nothing installed in the system. It would be the same thing for uninstalling user level profiles, except you wouldn't be using sudo. You'd be using the privileges of the logged in user to do it. So you can also use the OS's ability to install profiles which are stored in a particular directory. The OS will check the directory mentioned on the screen at startup. So if the directory has profiles and there is not a .profile setup done file present in the directory, the OS is automatically going to install the profiles stored in that directory. So let's take a look at how this works. Let's go ahead and run sudo cp for copy. I'm going to specify our disable airdrop mobile config file on the desktop. We're going to be copying in a private var db configuration profiles setup. And we're just going to keep the same file name. So disable airdrop.mobile config. Put our password for sudo. All right. And then we're going to go ahead and remove that file that tells the system that it shouldn't be installing any profiles in here. So we're going to remove .profile setup done. All right. Let's go ahead and quit out. Now let's go ahead and restart. As part of the reboot process, the OS has checked that directory, sees that there's a profile there to install, and then went ahead and installed it as part of the boot process. So as you can see, where we previously didn't have a profile installed, now we do. And this is a capability that I think that was first introduced in macOS 10.7 Lion, and it's still there in macOS Catalina today. So you can leverage these two different installation methods by building an installer package to deploy profiles. So in this case, you would install the profile's mobile config file somewhere convenient. And at that point, a script in the installer could use logic to determine if the profile is being installed onto the boot drive or not. And if it's being installed on the boot drive, then you use the profiles tool to install it. Otherwise, you would use the option to install the profile at the drive's next startup. And if you want a tool that can create installer packages to install profiles, Tim Sutton's Make Profile package does this, and it uses the installation logic I was describing a few minutes ago. Now, one thing that is noteworthy is that Apple has said that the ability to install profiles using the Profiles command line tool is going to be going away. It is deprecated. So what I would recommend for installing profiles going forward is probably also the most common ways to deploy profiles at this point. That is using a mobile device management server or an MDM. So in this case, you would enroll a device with an MDM server. Go ahead, install that configuration profile, and get it set up with your MDM server. And any profiles that would automatically deploy should then start to show up on their own. And after enrollment, the device would be managed and be able to receive profiles from the MDM server. Now, of all the profile development methods available, I would say that MDM deployment is both the most popular and also the most effective. So why use MDM? Why is it the most effective? I mean, sure, you can use it to deploy all your profiles, but you can use other means for this, right? We were just discussing alternate deployment methods. Well, up until macOS Sierra, maybe you could. But with the introduction of macOS High Sierra, though, things changed. Before we get into that, though, I want to first take a look at some past history, and so indulge me for a moment. Starting with OS X Mavericks, Apple made changes to how third-party kernel extensions had been allowed to operate. So with Mavericks, we start to see Apple saying that third-party kernel extensions should now be signed with the special developer certificate, which is only used for kernel extensions. And those signed KEXs should now go into library extensions, which is a new location. I know not all vendors use that location, but that's where they're supposed to be going. In Yosemite, the requirement changed, so now third-party kernel extensions must be signed and they must be going into library extensions. Again, I know some vendors aren't obeying those rules. With El Capitan and the introduction of system integrity protection, that code signing is now enforced. macOS Sierra stays with this model where third-party kernel extensions must be signed and must go into library extensions. With the introduction of macOS High Sierra, though, things changed again. Apple introduced what would become known as user-approved kernel extension loading. Instead of kernel extensions loading automatically, now there was an approval process. First, you got this message letting you know that the kernel extension was blocked from loading. Then you had to go into the security preferences and click a button. You don't want to manage kernel extensions this way? Well, Apple also provided the option of booting to macOS recovery and running commands. Now you can modify the list of kernel extensions using the spctl command, but only while booted from the recovery environment for the specific Mac that you want to manage. Now, this is relatively easy for an individual to do, but how do you manage this for more than a handful of machines? Well, that alternative is MDM Enrollment. For High Sierra 10.13.0 through 10.13.3, if a particular Mac was enrolled into an MDM solution, kernel extensions management went back to the macOS Sierra model. So in this enforcement model, user approval was no longer needed for third-party kernel extensions. And this also marked the first time that some large enterprise environments really needed an MDM solution for Mac management. Why? Well, many security tools use kernel extensions, and those kernel extensions need to load in order for the security tool to operate properly. Starting with 10.13.4, Apple began enforcing what's now known as user-approved MDM. Now, having an automated enrollment into MDM didn't grant all MDM management rights. Instead, a human being now needed to go and click a button in the profile's preference pane. And Apple also went to some trouble to make sure that this button could not be clicked using automated means. Among other items, they disabled the ability to click the approval buttons via remote screen sharing. And once approved, all MDM management rights are now available. Now, this is important because Apple began requiring UA MDM be enabled before certain management rights were available. The first was management of third-party kernel extensions in 10.13.4. A new kernel extension whitelist profile became available, but it only worked on Macs where UA-MDM was enabled. This new profile allowed you to whitelist kernel extensions by vendor or by the individual kernel extension. Without this whitelisting, the logged in user will be asked to approve the loading of third-party kernel extensions, even if the Mac is enrolled into an MDM. Meanwhile, starting on macOS Mojave, Apple introduced new privacy protections for data stored in the user's home folder and elsewhere. When an outside tool or process tries to access public protected data, dialog windows like this appear. Now, alongside with those protections, Apple introduced another management right that's only available to Macs with UA-MDM enabled. And this was the ability to whitelist the ability of specified tools and processes to access areas otherwise put off limits by Mojave's new user protections. Without this whitelisting, the logged in user will be asked to approve or deny actions by those tools or processes. So it seems likely that Apple will be putting more and more management behind UA-MDM, which makes it all the more important that managed Macs be enrolled with an MDM and stay that way. So now that I've been talking about profiles and how useful they are, let's talk about where they may fall short for management on Macs. So as mentioned earlier, profiles in the earlier managed preferences did not provide total management for Macs. So as an example of this, here's a list of some management tasks that profiles can and can't do. So what can fill that gap? Well, scripting. Unlike iOS, Macs have long had the ability to run scripts written in a variety of programming languages. As an example of this, let's look again at our list of management tasks. In this case, scripting can do everything specified where profiles couldn't. Now, for those folks who noticed that I left application access off the list on the last slide, that is something that is going to be involving something more than just scripting. But even there, application whitelisting and blacklisting tools are available outside of profile management. So how do you choose when to use a profile or use a script? Well, Apple's made it pretty clear that profile management is what they see as the future. So the first thing I would check is to see if there is a profile payload that does what you need. If there isn't, then you're going to need to use the script or some other tool. And the reason you'll want to check the payload list is that there are some settings that are going to look like they should be manageable with a profile, but they can't be. A good example is the gatekeeper rearm functionality. Now, this setting is manageable with the defaults write command, which is usually a good indicator that it can be managed with a profile. However, as pointed out by one of my colleagues, the tool Apple uses to read the settings doesn't work with profiles. And that means that the only way to manage the setting is by using the defaults write command. And this remains true as in macOS Catalina. Now, for those interested, I have a bug report open for this, which is available by the link shown on the screen. And as you can see, it's been open for a while. Now, if there is an available payload, the next thing you want to check is if you want to manage that setting once or always. If you want to always manage that setting, a profile is going to be the best choice. If you want to manage it once, a script is the best answer. And one more thing to check is if the profile you want works for the latest OS. Apple may have fixed something which wasn't previously working. And a good example of this is a profile using the software update payload. On Mojave, this profile does not manage the setting to automatically install macOS updates. As a result, you're better off using a script on macOS Mojave to enable automatic installation of macOS updates. Meanwhile, on Catalina, Apple fixed this issue, and the same profile now properly manages the macOS update setting. While the script still works on Catalina, it's now no longer needed. So how do you choose when to use a profile or a script? My advice, which again is based on Apple's signaling that profiles are the way forward, is to see if you can use a profile. If not, use a script. But don't just assume that a profile will never work for your purposes. Recheck every so often to see if the situation has changed. Because you can never have too much information about this particular subject, I got some useful links. Some more useful links. Some more useful links. And hopefully the most useful links you see in this entire talk, because this is how you get the talk itself. PDF with speaker's notes is available from the link at the top of the screen, and keynote slides, which contain the talk, everything I've been speaking from, all the demos, all the everything, that's available by the link on the bottom of the screen. And with that, let's see. I think how are we doing on time for questions?
I think we're doing pretty good on time for questions. We have quite a few, actually. So let's see. The first one we have is, can you explain in which cases users cannot bypass device enrollment by not being on the network at initial setup? We've historically, this person has had too many Macs that should have dep enrolled, but did not, and had to go back and manually enroll them. So is there any advice to ensuring that enrollment occurs during that initial setup? I believe is the question.
Unfortunately, I know that when you're off the network at the time that you're supposed to be running it, you can bypass DEP. I'm not certain of the circumstances where you cannot bypass DEP. So for that one, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. I'm going to have to do some research and possibly get back to that person.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a problem that macOS has that iOS avoids by requiring an activation.
Yeah.
Right. So until macOS maybe requires an activation, perhaps that's a bug to be followed with them.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So what happens if two profiles manage the same setting? Can you be more specific with a profile to take an effect? And can you could you possibly put them into Git and run some checkout rules to detect collisions?
With the Git related question, you know what? It's an amazing world. People can do whatever they want. Yeah, that's going to be up to whatever tooling you put in place. If you are trying to manage the same setting with two different profiles, if you're trying to manage the exact same setting, what's going to happen is undefined. You have no idea what's going to take place. What should happen is the most restrictive setting applies. But in general, what happens is undefined if you're trying to do the exact same setting. So in general, don't do that.
Okay. Very good. When updating an existing configuration profile and keeping the same payload identifier, should you change the top level UUID or also leave it unchanged like you do for the payload identifier?
You should be changing that profile. You should be changing that top level UUID because otherwise it's not going to know that it's different. It's like you swap it out and you tell the system, okay, Bob, I need you to switch out with Bob. System's going to go, which Bob? So you always want to give it something different to look at, and the top level UUID is a good place to make it look different.
What about Bob? Okay.
What about Bob, man?
What is the best method to update an existing profile that is applied to all computers, where they might need to add a new value in to the same profile that these computers already have?
I'm going to say that's going to depend on what kind of profile it is, whether or not you're going to, like in the case of Jamf Pro, it has a profile editor that you can just edit the profile, make a change, and then it'll give you the option of, do you want to push this out to everybody, or do you want to push this out just to the systems that haven't yet received this profile? So I would say if you can use that kind of method. If you're doing something where you're handcrafting a profile and it's signed, best thing I can say there is actually don't try to update. What I would say is delete the existing profile and then upload a new profile with a different UUID generated for it. Because what should happen in that case is that the MDM should pull off the old profile from the machines and then start deploying the new profile in its place.
Okay. Okay, great. Another question: are encrypted profiles viewable, parentheses, human readable, in the profiles pane?
That's a good question, because normally when I've been in my testing, what I've done for that is been doing them with MCX style profiles, in which case I don't remember if you can actually read that or not. In my testing, the answer was, for what I was doing, the answer was no, but I don't know if that's universal.
Okay. Okay. Another question we have is, so one of the things we run into fairly often is a machine that is erase installed and doesn't have a network connection, so it doesn't get the MDM. I found it's great to be able to kick it to get a profile with a profiles renew type enrollment command once the network is reconnected. If profiles is depreciated, if profiles is depreciated or going to be depreciated, is there another way to handle that other than reinstalling again? Parentheses, loaner laptops that are often imaged by student employees who forget to plug the cable in.
I should clarify, the profiles command line tool itself is not deprecated. Using profiles to install and remove, those specific functions are deprecated. So I believe that your workflow should continue to work without an issue.
Okay. Let's see. Is it possible to add more MDM enabled local users?
No, you just get the one.
Okay. Stingy. Great talk. And here's a silly question. What are you using to virtualize current-ish versions of macOS? Definitely not a silly question.
It is off topic, but VMware Fusion in my case.
Cool. Here's a silly question. Style question for the profile identifier value. The different tools that create profiles have different options on what the format should be. Even profiles created within an MDM, like Jamf Pro, have an opinion. What format have you standardized on? Reverse domain, then UUID? Reverse domain, then human readable name?
I guess I have my own opinion on that. I generally I try to use something human readable at the beginning that's related to my company, and then then I use UUID gen to give me a nice UUID, and I slap that on at the end. Now that's assuming I'm handcrafting an MDM profile. You know, if I'm using Jamf Pro's editor to do it, then I'm not editing that part. I'm using whatever Jamf Pro sticks in there.
Okay. Are all preference panes within system preferences able to be set using configuration profiles? So perhaps are the settings within all of the panes? Is anything that Apple provides in system preferences, any of those settings or all of those settings available?
Not on macOS. I know there are specifically some settings in system preferences that you need to go into, like the management database for. There's other things that, like in my example of Gatekeeper, that can only be managed via default write command. So it's kind of going to be all over the place. A lot of things are going to be manageable with profiles. It's not going to be universal.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Well, here's another. Which do you prefer? Individual profiles for each payload, or larger monolithic profiles with multiple payloads?
I would say it's going to depend on what I'm trying to manage. Like, for example, if it is something like we have a profile that is managing security settings, like password complexity for local user accounts, whether or not firewall is enabled, my shop tends to group by function. My own preference, if I'm doing it for myself, is I try to do, if I can't group by a particular function, I'll break it out into individual profiles. The more in general, I found that the more granular you get, the easier it is to trade them in and out. I've seen people do kind of everything in one mammoth profile, and it just gets really unwieldy after a while, especially if you need to change that profile out, because now you have all these settings getting ripped off the machine and then reapplied, and it can be a mess.
Okay, that that leads into the next question. Is there a limit on how many device profiles can be installed on macOS?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to, unfortunately. If there is, I haven't hit it yet.
Yeah, that's a Guinness Book record that still has to be breached. What is the best way to enroll an older Mac that is not available with device enrollment? But using an enrollment program that does not require user administration. So maybe how do we automatically enroll older systems that can't use device enrollment?
That is a good question, because you can enroll, but you won't get UA MDM automatically. There is no way to automatically enroll and get user approved MDM unless you're using device enrollment. So, like for example, on Jamf Pro, you can use you can still have it generate a quick add package, and that'll get you into MDM, but it won't be user approved MDM. Other solutions, it's kind of the same story. Apple really, if you are enrolling using automated means, if you are not using device enrollment, which is kind of Apple's bright line for this isn't a personally owned system, you're gonna need a human being at some point to click that button to say user approved MDM is fine with me.
Okay. So is there a requirement with the AD schema for Mac specific variables if you're binding a machine to AD?
Wow, extending the AD schema. I haven't hered that one in a while. That was more for MCX.
Triangle, yeah.
Yeah, so the extending the AD schema is not a requirement these days. It never was. It was handy if you wanted to have MCX coming from your Active Directory domain. But I think at this point that's a technique that's fallen by the wayside.
No AD anymore. Do you personally like to deploy a profile for a large number of machines? Also, is there a way to temporarily disable one of my client machine's profiles without removing the profile completely?
I guess that for the first part, how do I personally like to deploy them? I guess that depends on whether or not I need UA-MDM or not. If I need UA-MDM, then it's going to be deploying them via an MDM. If I don't need UA-MDM, like in my own case, I tend to build virtual machines using Mac deploy stick. And in that case, I'm not binding them to an MDM server at all. So in that case, I just have a bunch of installer programs set up and ready to install, just kind of one after the other. So it's going to be circumstantial. But by and large, I would say if you're deploying profiles to a large number of machines, MDM is the way to go. Apple is increasingly pointing, that MDM is the future and you should be using it.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget what the other half of the question was.
The question has been published and disappeared from you. How is it stable?
I think you're breaking up on me.
To disable a profile without removing it?
No, I don't know of any way to disable a profile without removing it.
I just started using Intune for MDM. During boot, the computer presents the enrollment profile, but then it takes hours to get the remaining profiles and run a shell script. Is there a command to force a check-in on the client end?
For Intune, I don't know. And that's usually the kind of thing that's going to be specific to that MDM solution. With Intune, I'm not aware that there's an agent along with it. It's pure MDM to the best of my knowledge. Because normally if it has an accompanying agent, you can tell the agent, go check in with the server and do stuff. If it's pure MDM, you're kind of waiting for whatever the next MDM check-in, whatever that is.
Okay. The config profiles you showed were displayed as unverified in the profiles panel. Can these be signed with my own server certificate to make them verified?
Yes. The difference between unverified and verified is basically, did you sign the certificate with a valid SSL certificate? So that most folks tend to use like Apple developer certificates for that, because the certificate chain for that is already present on your Mac, and Apple makes sure that it's there. But you could use any trusted certificate to do that. Rusty, unfortunately, you just turned into a silent movie on me, but I think the question asked is that you want to use Mac deploy stick using an enrollment profile? Okay. So for others who just saw Rusty turn into a silent movie, the question is, I want to use a Mac deploy stick using an enrollment profile that does not require user authentication, but wondering if it's possible to make an enrollment profile that does not require user authentication before installing. That's going to depend on your MDM solution. And the answer there is that if your MDM solution does allow for an automated enrollment, you'll still need to click the button for user approved MDM.
Okay.
Oh, and he's back.
And I'm back. During initial Mac setup, does device enrollment care about Wi-Fi versus Ethernet network connection?
In my experience, it mostly cares, do I have a connection to the internet? Because I've set it up with a Wi-Fi connection. I've set it up with Ethernet. As long as it's able to get out and contact Apple and the services it needs to, it doesn't seem to care in my experience.
Okay, great. If you delete a config profile, but the clients didn't reach out before the delete, how do you remove it from the clients after that, so it's not available anymore on Jamf?
So speaking specifically for Jamf, what should happen when it gets deleted is that the Jamf database retains a record of that profile, and it'll retain a record that it was deleted, and thus it'll try to pull it off of any machine that still has it on. I actually recently had a case where I was replacing a profile where I was deleting it off and replacing it with a similar one that had a different identifier on it. And what I was finding was that on some machines, we had both the new and the old profile there. And the fix there was to set up a profile with the same identifier as the one I wanted to delete. I didn't have to scope it or anything. I just had to set it up. Basically, I made one by hand with the exact same identifier as the one I wanted to delete it, and then uploaded that to Jamf Pro. Didn't scope it, didn't do anything, and then right after uploading, I deleted it. And that allowed Jamf Pro to get that identifier registered in its database as a profile that needed to be pulled from systems. So as soon as I hit save and then hit delete, almost immediately the profile popped off of my Mac, because my Mac was one of the affected systems where it had both the new and the old one on it.
Nice.
Now, not all MDMs are going to work that way. I'm just speaking here specifically for JamPro, because that's the way they work. Could be different MDM solutions handle this differently.
Yeah. Okay. If a computer is not receiving profiles from an MDM, and the MDM profile is not removable, is there any other way to fix it outside of a nuke and pave?
Non-removable MDM. That is a bugger. So what I have, the solution I've seen for that is to boot into recovery mode and then remove, and I don't remember the exact location of it, but you remove the database that stores all the profile information. And once you delete that and reboot, your non-removable MDM profile will be gone. So will all your other profiles. But at that point, at least you'll be able to kind of start over again, because it should regenerate a new one on boot. So that's one way that you could avoid a nuke and pave in that situation.
Okay. Are there any things that you should avoid using in a UUID for profiles? For example, is Bob valid as a UUID?
Bob is not. UUIDs are supposed to follow a particular framework. They're supposed to be alphanumeric. Supposed to be a certain length. They can be either uppercase or lowercase letters. They don't have symbols. I guess you could, if you put, I guess, 1 on the end of Bob, it could technically be a UUID, but it's not nearly long enough for a classic UUID. So overall, I'm going to have to say no, because it's not alphanumeric. Bob is not a valid UUID.
Okay. If you delete a config profile, but the clients didn't reach, oh, I'm sorry, we asked that one. Yep. For accessibility in the security and privacy preferences pane, will it show the setting that's been configured? For example, if you push out a Wacom or another kernel extension or privacy policy access.
To the best of my knowledge, it doesn't show up. Like, if you're asking if that checkbox gets checked, I don't believe it does. The only time it does get checked is when a human being goes in and does it, which is bad user experience. So file bugs with Apple about that one.